Are you sure?
Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never ask a bride why she's getting married. Don't wear a skirt on a windy day. Deodorant is not a shower. Don't sniff chili flakes. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint. And now this time we're going to be talking about something that's happening with our export and import numbers that's very, very interesting. It's not only to do with how much we're exporting, how much we're importing, it's to do with what we're exporting and importing and to which countries. There are changes that have happened over the last year or so. And to look at all of that data, to look at all of these trends, we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us.
Thank you, Sharad.
So now, Radhika, let's first look at the overall export and import numbers and, how they have changed and whether they were driven more by merchandise or by services.
Right. So if we first look at exports,
Right.
overall exports, when we talk of both exports of goods and services, there has been an increase from somewhere around $76 billion to $778 billion. So overall our exports have risen, but if we look purely from the perspective of goods exports, merchandise exports,
Right.
our merchandise exports have contracted in the last financial year. They dipped by almost 3%, but because our services exports did well, therefore overall our exports showed a positive growth.
Right.
So that was on the export side. On the import side also, there was a steeper decline in our imports, mainly because of decline in global commodity prices, and therefore imports, particularly merchandise imports, declined by 5.6%. So while merchandise exports declined by 3%, merchandise imports declined by 5.6%,
Right.
and therefore overall when we look at the trade balance, goods trade balance as well as overall trade balance, it improved. Overall trade balance improved because services came to our rescue,
Right.
but even the goods trade balance improved because our imports fell more than the fall in exports.
Right. Okay, so now looking at imports, you mentioned that this is driven by commodity prices falling, global
Right.
commodity prices falling. So, I mean, is it more to do with this? It's not to do with the fact that we're importing less?
Yeah, so it's more to do with the fact that there has been a decline in prices of commodities, because if we look at oil, one of our major importable commodity, which accounts for almost 27% of our import basket, it showed a decline of 14% in imports in terms of value,
Right.
and that was mainly because of decline in crude oil prices after the increase that we saw in 2022. We saw overall there was a moderation in all commodity prices, and that is one of the major reasons responsible for decline in imports overall in value terms. We can look at some of the other components, but just in terms of some broad categories, oil prices, oil imports declined, and then non-oil imports also declined, but that decline is more to do with non-oil, non-gold and silver imports, because if we look at gold imports,
Those
that
rose.
increased.
Right.
That increased, gold imports increased, silver imports also increased, and this happened despite increase in prices of gold. So gold prices increased and even the quantity of gold imported increased. So gold imports increased by 31%, whereas gold prices increased only by 10%. So that means that there is not only an increase in the prices that has led to increase in imports, but also the quantity of gold has increased. So that indicates an increase in the demand for gold, and which is still continuing. If you look at the April data, there was again a massive spurt in imports, and that is driven by gold imports. We did a
Right.
talk on this about gold, that how gold prices have been rising. So that story is still playing out, and that is reflected in our imports data as well.
Okay, so now if you take out oil and you take out gold and silver,
Correct.
what remains? What has been happening with that?
Yeah, so if we strip off gold, silver, and if we remove oil, then we are left with what is a broad category called non-oil, non-gold, and silver imports. And there, some of the categories which have again shown a decrease is fertilizer imports, and fertilizer imports have fallen by almost 40%. Mainly due to again decrease in natural gas prices, which is one of the critical inputs for fertilizers.
Right.
We have seen also decline in vegetable oil imports, which is again a very major item of our imports, which suffered a lot during the time of Russia-Ukraine war.
Absolutely.
Because they are the major suppliers of vegetable oil. So and since then we have seen a moderation. So vegetable oil imports also decline. To some extent, it's also due to muted demand. For example, our imports of pearls and precious stones, those are raw materials for gems and jewelry.
Right, we polish them and then
we
we export them.
We refine and then we export.
Right.
So gems and jewelry are our export items, whereas pearl, precious stones are our import items. So because gems and jewelry exports decline because of muted demand in our major export markets, therefore the imports of pearls, precious stones also decline. So overall, if we look at some of the broad categories, we see that there has been a decline. It's not that the decline is broad-based across all categories, but yes, some of the major non-oil, non-gold, silver components have witnessed a decline. One main factor is decline in prices.
Right.
The other factor is because the finished goods is facing hindrances in the export market, therefore the demand for raw material has also come down.
Okay, so but overall you'd say that it's more significantly the fact that prices have come down.
Correct, and that's very visible if you see broad-based prices of natural gas, prices of coal have come down, and coal is again a major import commodity. We import from Malaysia, we import from Indonesia, so their prices have come down. It's an input in our thermal plants, so there also imports. One factor is of course reliance more on domestic and also shift towards renewable energy sources.
Right.
But one major factor is that there has been a very sharp decline in prices of commodities across the board. Oil prices, vegetable, coal, all these prices have come down, and that is getting reflected in our imports data. But this is going to change now. It was only a 23-24 story.
Right. No, and no, I feel this is an important point to make also, because a lot of times people see falling imports as a sign that the economy is slowing.
Correct.
But this is not all that much to do with demand. There is some amount of demand,
Absolutely.
as you talked about,
Yeah.
but most of it is to do with prices.
Yeah, it has to do with prices. Yeah.
Right. So now coming to exports, which categories of merchandise exports have suffered more, and why?
Yeah, so again, exports have suffered mainly because of demand, and we've talked about this. There has been a global trade slowdown. 2023 was not a very good year for global trade. Geopolitical conflicts, muted demand, high interest rates that dented exports, and also we impose restrictions on our export
Right.
items. So agri exports suffered because we imposed restrictions on rice, onion, sugar. So that led to a decline in agri exports.
Wheat as well, right?
Wheat as well. So that, and rice. If you look at rice, it constitutes 21% of our agricultural exports.
Right.
So if there is a duty, there is a restriction on rice exports, that tends to impact the entire basket of agri exports, and agri exports is 11% of our merchandise exports, and it suffered because of imposition of duties. The other important component that suffered was leather manufacturers, again due to less demand in some of our major markets, mainly US and Europe. We export 50% of our leather products to Europe,
Right.
and there was a slowdown in demand that led to decline in leather products. But now what we are seeing, some good positive signals that are emerging, is that we are tying up with newer markets. We are seeing some interest from Taiwanese companies. They are setting up their leather manufacturing facilities in Tamil Nadu, because Tamil Nadu is one of the major exporter of leather products.
Right.
So things are changing, because ultimately we have to reduce reliance on fewer markets and diversify our export basket to ensure that we are less susceptible to global headwinds. So leather is one sector that was affected. Engineering goods, that accounts for 1/4 of our total export basket. Export basket meaning the goods export basket, 1/4 of that. That saw an increase, but that saw an increase of only 2%, mainly because of decline in exports to the US.
Right.
So engineering goods growth was slow due to decline in the demand from the US. But again, positive feature is that we saw a resurgence in our exports to other markets, namely Saudi Arabia, UAE increased. So we are seeing newer markets. In fact, our exports to Russia increased a lot, or exports of engineering goods to Russia increased. So our trade with Russia has been increasing, not only imports but also exports. So we are seeing that in some of the traditional markets, our exports have suffered, but slowly we are seeing an increase in the exports in other markets.
Okay, and so now, are there any other sectors that have shown resilience?
Correct. Yeah. So resilience, we see two sectors that have actually done well. One is the electronic goods exports, and that we have seen that till a few years back, electronic goods did not even feature amongst the top 10 export items, and this year it has featured as the 4th most exported item. So it is now part of the top 5, and now from 5th it has become 4th in a matter of 2 years. So electronic goods is doing well, and there also we are seeing that we are exporting mostly to the United States, but also to other markets like Netherlands. So there we are again exploring newer markets. But within electronic goods, the sub item that is doing well is the telecom instruments. Right. If we look at, if we just take a disaggregated view of top 10 export items, not just the broad categories, but top 10 export items, we see that within electronic goods, the only one component that features is the telecom instruments.
Which is mobile handsets.
Yes, mobile handsets, 4G, 5G manufacturers, routers, all these things. So that is most important. Other than that, other top 10 items are from pharmaceutical categories, from engineering goods, transport equipment, and so on. So we are seeing a shift towards high value added commodities, electronic goods. So electronic goods is one sector, and the other is the pharma. These two sectors grew, and they grew quite handsomely. Electronic goods posted a growth of 22%, and pharma grew by 10%.
Okay, and so now we've talked about both export and imports. Now, what does this say about our trade deficit and how it's been changing with particular countries?
Yeah, so again, as I said, if you look at the merchandise trade deficit, it has improved because our imports fell by more than the fall in exports. And there also what we are seeing is that our trade deficit with China and Russia increased further. We are importing from China and Russia, we are the net importers, and the trade deficit with China and Russia widened further in FY24, the year that has just ended. But with some of the other countries with whom also we have structural trade deficit, there the trade deficit actually narrowed. For example, with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Indonesia, our trade deficit narrowed. That means we are exporting more than what we are importing. And with some of the countries with whom we have a trade surplus, like with US, Netherlands, our trade surplus increased further. So those are some of the structural changes that we are seeing. And similarly, if we are seeing that there are some countries which may be very small in terms of their share in India's export basket, but there has been an increase in the year-on-year growth of exports. Though the share is still small, but there is a shift towards exploring newer markets that is visible in the data.
That's fantastic. So now, of course, we have a few questions from the audience. Mridul has 2 questions. I'll start. The first is that, see, it's a well-known fact now that the beggar thy neighbor policies like imposing tariffs or quotas and other restrictions only harm the prospects of the country that's imposing them. In fact, most of India's exports are import sensitive, and participation in the global value chains requires trade liberalization immensely. So, if all of this is common sense, why has India turned more protectionist in the recent past?
Yeah, that's true. We have turned more protectionist. Our average tariff rates have increased. But having said that, it has become a global trend. You see, there's a revival of protectionism globally. If you see US, China, every day we are seeing US is imposing some tariffs, then China is imposing retaliatory measures. So this trend is part partly it is the fact that it's part of the global phenomenon. Secondly, it is also has to do with geopolitical tensions, and also has to do with food inflation, where we see that a part of the tariffs that have been imposed are on agri commodities, and clearly the government policy seems to be more biased towards consumers than farmers, and that is getting reflected in agri export. We see that tariffs were imposed, export duties were imposed, and that is not something which is a good point from the perspective of improving agri farm income or for improving agricultural export prospects. So that is something that definitely has to that has to be thought through, and protectionism has to be reduced. Also from the perspective, if we want to improve our share as part of the China Plus One strategy, because till now, 3 years since COVID, it's not that we have seen a major shift in India's share in global trade.
Right.
India's share has only marginally increased from 1.7% to 1.9%. So we still have a lot of work to do. Some work is being done, but there is a lot of thing that needs to be done. Our structure of exports needs to shift from low value to high value items. We need to reduce tariffs. We need to come up with a review of the free trade agreements that have been undertaken, why we are having persistent trade imbalances with countries with whom we have undertaken FTAs. We need to monitor the policies of those countries with whom we have undertaken FTAs. So a lot of there is a lot that needs to be done structurally, as well as ease of doing business, logistics, FDI. A lot needs to be done to become a major player in the global value chain.
Right, and so you mentioned the agri exports and how it's favoring the consumers over the farmers, and so Mridul's second question has to do with that, which is how come the farmers are not protesting, and how can we connect the farmers with the export market in a more free way?
Yeah, so see, farmers have been protesting. It's just that we don't get to see the pace of the intensity of protest. But when export curbs were imposed on onions, we saw a lot of protests at Nasik, the mandi, where
they were throwing them on the ground.
They were throwing, So there were protests for some days at a stretch. Mandis were shut down, so protests were there, and that is something which needs to be addressed. This is not a policy that should be followed, and that too in a haphazard manner. Anytime duties are restrictions are imposed on agri exports, given that there's high food inflation, but steps have to be taken for other things, like for improving storage infrastructure, logistics, improving productivity, investments in seed, irrigation, so that we become more productive. And if at all some restrictions are to be imposed in place of ban, export duty is a milder way rather than imposing ban. So there has to be a review of this, complete review, overhaul of this policy of imposing random bans on exports of agri commodities. And this is also an obstacle towards government's own objective of augmenting farmers' income.
Of course. And now finally we have a question by Aditya. He connects two different things that are happening. He asks, do you think that the decrease in FDI in India will impact the sentiment on global trade as well, to do with India, and we might see some reduction in global exports, considering the fact that companies might find it better to get their imports from other countries where they are investing in?
See, when we talk about FDI, we need to understand this time what has happened is that the outflows have been more than inflows.
Yes.
So it's not that the inflows have suffered, it's that the outflows have increased, or in terms of FDI, what we say, the repatriation or the disinvestment has increased. And there could be multiple reasons for that. One has to do with high interest rates in other countries, persistent high interest rate. That is also one of the factors responsible for repatriation, and other unfavorable factors in India that has to be there. But so one needs to understand the anatomy of FDI, the trajectory of FDI, and the peculiarity of FDI trend, particularly in FY24. Now, this will have an impact on exports, but exports I think has to do with other things. It has to do with duties, it has to do with comparative advantage, where in which markets comparative advantage lie, and definitely, as we pointed out, that India has to become part of global value chain, and it has to take advantage of China plus one strategy. Till now it has not been able to take. There are countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh that have fared better. So there has to be a complete understanding of in which markets we fare better, and the transition has to take place. It has taken place. It's not that we have not improved. If we just take 5 years data, 2014, 15 and now, or 10 years data, we see that the top 5 commodities that were there earlier and top 5 commodities now, we have moved towards higher value items, and this is a positive sign if we have to become integrated with global value chain. Electronic goods, there is a new trade promotion council that has been set up for telecom instruments and equipment and services promotion council, where they have set up a ambitious goal of $100 billion of exports by 2047, exploring newer markets. So those are the things that we need to do rather than imposing restrictions and quotas to protect the domestic industries. That will harm competitiveness. And the other thing is also to look at our inverted duty structures. In some of the items, in some of the segments, we have inverted duty structure, and that has to be corrected alongside an overview of the FTAs, because there is something that we have been having persistent imbalances. So that is something that needs to be understood.
So there you go. What the data shows us is that there are a lot of policy implications from what's happening with our trade data and what is happening with our overall exports and imports. Exports, you can say that they're falling because global demand is falling, but the thing is, we can't just rest at that. We have to expand the countries that we are exporting to, because as we've seen from some sectors, as we have widened the net, those sectors have been resilient. That's one. There are several reforms that we have to do within India, several policies to strengthen our own internal sectors so that they can export better. We need to stop doing these arbitrary tariffs or bans on exports to do with agriculture commodities, because that's just disruptive to our internal systems, and it doesn't help farmers either. On the import side, imports have fallen, but the thing is that it's not to do with a slowdown in economic activity. It's more to do with commodity prices falling, which is good. It's always good for our input prices to be lower. So that's a good thing. But overall, there are a lot of policy implications that the new government should think about. But on that note, that's all from us. Thank you so much for watching.